Welcome to the Agent of Wealth podcast with Mark Bautis from Bautis Financial. In this podcast, Mark helps guide you towards financial freedom, ensure you never run out of money, and create a balance in life that prioritizes what is most important to you. Join us for this journey as Mark draws from years of expertise and guest experts to solve the multiple wealth building challenges involved in your financial life.
Welcome back to the Agent of Wealth. This is your host, Mark Bautis. Today we're doing something a little different. It's one of our Bautis Financial Book Club discussions. If you've been following along, you know this series is all about exploring books that challenge us, inspire us, or help us grow, whether that's professionally, personally, or both. It's a chance for our team to dig into new ideas and share how we can apply them in the work we do with our clients in our own lives. This is our 18th book, and this time Kayla picked Upstream, The Quest to Solve Problems Before They Happen by Dan Heath. A book that really challenges the way we think about problems, prevention, and systemic change. Kayla, what made you pick this book?
I picked this book because it comes from our conversations that we've been having about how we can automate stuff. Like internally, we've been talking about using Zapier, how we can utilize Google and just other software that we use. Also like the playbooks that we internally use. So we're constantly not doing manual things that we could just automate. And then that way we could spend more time working with clients and doing things that are more fulfilling. So this book kind of puts some framework around that mindset. And instead of reacting every time something breaks or gets missed, it asks why that issue exists in the first place and how the system could be built better. We already have like those internal workflows that I was talking about, but I think this book would be good to give us ideas of how we could refine them to prevent problems instead of just working as things come up.
Yeah, nice. I think it's definitely relevant to things we're doing. You know, after, I guess this is our 18th one, and you kind of see the trend of, since we all rotate on picking them, you see the trends. I know you usually pick a financial book. So this one, I was surprised when I saw this one, but it's definitely, even after reading, I thought it was great and definitely relevant to what we're doing. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Kayla, to lead today's discussion.
Thanks, Mark. The first question is for John. What does going upstream really mean? And can we shift from reacting to prevention?
Looking at this concept, it just seems so simple in its own right? So, but as humans, it's not the way we operate typically. It reminds me of, when I wake up in the morning, I go straight to my email and I look to taking care of things. What I mean by that is that could be something different for everybody, like putting out fires, solving problems. And sometimes you just get so busy, just don't have necessarily the time, or you never really have that focus on what potentially is causing those problems because you're always solving them, right? And I thought the author did an especially good job of giving examples throughout the book for all the concepts he was trying to get across and explain. And the first one, I think, really sets it up because it actually involves a stream. And he talks about how there is two people and they're standing by a stream and they see a child drowning or potentially struggling in the water. And then they go out and like, oh my gosh, we got to save this child. They go out, they save the child, and then they see another one, and they go out and they help each other. Like, oh my gosh, and then they just keep coming, right? And you're going out and you're saving these childs as they're coming downstream. And then at some point, one of them gets out of the water and starts to like walk upstream. He's like, well, what are you doing? He's like, I'm going to go upstream and figure out who's throwing these kids in the water. And it's an interesting concept because, like I said, it involves the stream and like how we're sitting there like, oh my gosh, save the kids. But somewhere up the stream, someone's throwing the kids in the water. And I thought it was a great way to lay the groundwork as to almost everything in our lives could potentially apply to this. It reminds me of when my experience as a runner and being in the running world. One of the biggest industries you saw in running, and if you've done some running at some point, or even just any activity, you may have heard of shin splints. And you think of shin splints, obviously, as a pain on the inside of your shin. And then, you get that shin splint and you like, okay, there's a pain in my shin. Let's look at that problem. It's usually a high volume situation where someone's doing a lot of running. Maybe they're increasing their running too much, but the shin splint is really the symptom, but the cause of that symptom is not immediate to somebody who might not understand biomechanics, where it's usually related to like arch support. And when it comes to injuries, I think a lot of times you're looking upstream. You're like, okay, well, there's knee pain. There's something else probably causing it. So, but you're tempted. All right, well, let's put a knee brace on. Let's take some ibuprofen to alleviate the pain. And I think throughout this conversation, we're probably going to hear a lot of examples to explain this, and there's reasons for it. But in the end, it's really just looking at a problem. And the cool thing I think about upstream is the idea that the stream could be long, and you can go upstream to the next thing, but there could be several different things that are actually upstream, and how far you go upstream is can sometimes be how effective you are at solving that potential problem in your life. So in the end, it really is, I think, a great name for the concept, because really what you're looking at is, all right, there's a problem and you go upstream, and there could be one thing that could help it, but you can continue to push upstream to potentially resolve some of those problems even more effectively the more you take the time and you're pushing upstream.
Yeah, I agree. I liked some of the stories that he used in there too. The next one is for Dylan. Why do some issues stay invisible until it's too late?
Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, so this chapter like really explains that the first barrier to prevention is something that they call problem blindness. And problem blindness is the tendency to fail to recognize a serious issue and treat it as something normal or inevitable, or just like assuming that nothing can be done about it. John, you just brought up about shin splints and injuries. The book actually brought up a story that I thought was like a really good example of problem blindness. It was the New England Patriots team doctor and physician, and they had a lot of hamstring injuries that were occurring to a lot of their players. Most people just kind of think that, injuries are just part of playing a sport, and that they're just freak injuries and it's just part of the game. But this doctor and trainer, he had a different philosophy about it, and he thought about it in a different way. So he thought that most injuries were the result of bad training. So he developed an individualized approach instead of like a one size fits all program. And he would study each player's strengths and weaknesses, like how they ran and like the muscle imbalances that they had. If one hamstring was stronger than the other. And he would split the players into groups based off of high risk for injuries, moderate risk, and low risk. And the high risk group would train more aggressively in the off season to like correct the muscular warning signs that the doctor found. So as a result of this new like training program and this new way of identifying muscular imbalances and players at different risk levels, the next season they were able to drop the number of hamstring injuries significantly. The previous season they had 22 hamstring injuries, and they were actually able to get that number to drop to just 3 the next season. Back to your question, why do problems stay invisible? Well, it's because we tend to normalize problems. When something happens often enough, it stops feeling alarming. And we kind of just assume that it's just how things are. The urgent problems that we see grab our attention, and the slow building ones don't. And we focus on what's loud instead of what's important. So if we can't name a problem, then we can't address it. And when you name a problem, you make it visible. And visibility is the first step toward change. So if you don't see the problem, you can't solve it upstream.
Thanks, Dylan. Mark, who's responsible when problems arise, and how does ownership drive prevention?
Yeah, so you're like, not my problem type of thing. But what Heath argues is that many problems persist because they fall into either cracks or between departments or jurisdictions. When people see a problem, they don't feel either empowered or obligated or responsible to fix it because it's not in their job description. And he claims there's 2 main reasons why ownership is rare, why someone takes ownership of a problem. So the first is the diffusion of responsibility. In a large system, responsibility, what happens is it's spread thin and therefore it becomes invisible. So basically, no one's responsible. Or there's the workaround culture. And you kind of think of this one where you're praised for being the hero. You fix a crisis or you solve the immediate problem downstream, rather than you're the architect or you're the one who prevented it, fixed the system, whatever the flaw was in the system upstream. So we kind of celebrate those crisis solvers when in fact we should be celebrating or praising the people that fixed the problem upstream. I think both Dylan and John have mentioned stories from there. And I think Heath does a great job. In each chapter, he gives multiple stories. They're short, they don't drag on, they kind of get to the point. The one that I liked from this chapter was he talks about a hypothetical scenario where a patient's in a hospital and they fall. Now, whose problem was it that they fell? Is it the nurse's fault because they weren't watching the patient? Is it the janitor's fault because the floor was wet? Is it the administrator who didn't buy non-slip mats that would have prevented this? And when you share the responsibility of it across all these different departments, what happens is no one actually figures out what caused the problem. So to have upstream success, what you need is you need someone to say, I'm the owner of this problem. I'll figure out what caused it, and we'll fix or change the failure that allowed it to happen. So what you want to do is you want to change the question from how do I fix this to how do I prevent it? Like the basement's flooded. Get them, I'll get a mop to wipe it up. When the preventive or the upstream thinking is why is the pipe leaking and let's replace the plumbing or let's fix the leak. So this chapter made me actually, not just this chapter, the book in general made me think of another book we covered in our book club, Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. Now they're a little bit different, right? This Heath is coming more of this from like a social experiment type of looking at things, whereas Willick's an ex-Navy SEAL. But what Jocko's one of his chapters was, or one of his most famous mantras is there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. And this chapter in Upstream echoes that through the lens of systems. So like the parallel is what he says is that, when a problem belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one. And this is what Jocko calls the failure of leadership. So the story he gives is when he recounts a mission where there's a blue, what's called a blue on blue, which is friendly fire. He took full responsibility, even though he wasn't the one that pulled the trigger and caused the shooting of their own troops. So what Heath would argue is that Jocko taking ownership, he moved upstream to be the owner of the problem, to fix the communication protocols rather than just blaming the individual soldier downstream. So, I thought this was kind of one of the core chapters of the book where it really hit right home of, taking ownership, how critical that is, no matter what you're trying to improve.
Yeah, taking ownership was a big takeaway from the book, I thought too. And then back to John, can you talk about tunneling and how narrow focus can blind us to bigger issues?
It's interesting. Like a lot of these chapters kind of bleed together. This concept is really intertwined with what Mark was talking about and what Kayla was talking about. And really one of the reasons why we're as humans, we get caught in this repetition of just, looking at the problem and solving the problem. And it talks actually specifically, I think, in the chapter about how you're just in this busy day and you almost have these blinders on where, you just get so used to solving those problems that it just becomes normal and it's just like any other day. And you don't really have the time or take the time to look upstream. And, it even talks a little bit about how we as humans find comfort in that spot and being in a tunnel where you get the opportunity to save the day. He tongue in cheek says oh, thanks to Steve for putting out that fire yesterday. Like we would have never got those reports in on time if it wasn't for him. There's comfort in that kind of in familiarity of like, okay, we need more towels. We're out of towels, so I'm just going to take them from another department, and that department just ends up running out. But no one actually takes the time to say, hey, well, look, why are we running out of towels? If there's a 3-day weekend, we need more. Or like, so I guess it's really just the concept is framing one of the reasons why we potentially get caught in this loop of solving problems and not going upstream.
Mark, the next chapter is called How Will You Change the System? What are some strategies for making meaningful systematic changes rather than just patching symptoms?
Yeah. So in the first chapter I talked about, chapter 3, was that was about finding someone to own the problem. This chapter, which turns out to be chapter 6, it's the blueprint for what that owner of the problem actually does to fix it. So this is the architect phase of the book where it turns into that section. What it does is he argues that if you want to change the outcome, you have to stop shouting at the people inside the system and start redesigning the system itself. So he leans on a classic systems thinking adage, which is every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So if your company has high turnover or your city has high crime, the system is currently working to produce those results. And if you want to change those results, you have to change the rules, the incentives, or the environment. And the way to do that, or the way he suggests to do that, is you want to identify the levers. So systems are held together by specific points of pressure. So, if you have, and these are called levers. So a lever could be like a policy or a default setting. And if you identify those and obviously change it, and it doesn't have to be a big change, you can create a massive ripple through the system and improve what's going on with it. So you want to shift your thinking shift the system from the point of service to the point of origin. So instead of fixing the person at the end of the line downstream, you want to go where the problem is born. What I talked about earlier, instead of getting the mop to fix the problem, fix the leak, or fix the puddle, you want to fix the leak where it's coming from. And what he says is systems often fail because they lack a sensor that tells or that demonstrates where they're failing in real time. So one of the things he kept insisting through this chapter is you have to have real-time triggers or real-time measurements to know where your system is breaking down. And the story, he again with this one, he gave multiple stories. The one that I liked the most was where he talks about the Chicago public schools. And they had this freshman on track kind of program, you want to call it. So Chicago was facing a crisis where only half of their students were graduating. What they would do, the old way of thinking, the downstream way, is you would focus on the seniors, right? Because they're the closest to graduating. So why don't we just fix or look at why aren't they graduating as they're getting close to graduation? And you try and save them in the last couple of months of high school. What happened was so they researched the problem and they found that ninth grade performance was the single best predictor of graduation. So the lever they created was a freshman success team. And it wasn't just to tutor kids. What they did is they changed the system so that every time a freshman missed a single class, what they called a data wall was updated. So that's your real-time trigger, your real-time monitoring. And a teacher intervened that day. They didn't wait a week, a month, or a specified period of time. They tried to get in front of it almost immediately. And I'm cutting out obviously details of the story, but the result was graduation rates skyrocketed because what they stopped trying to fix the problem with seniors and started designing successful freshmen. So kind of Kayla, one of you talked about like the systems and the operating procedures and playbooks that we're doing. This kind of hit home in that, if we start looking at the procedures that we're doing from the start, if we have a handle on those, it obviously creates us, to have a lot more successful results down the stream.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk about the next chapter, and I think it goes off of a lot of what you and everyone else has been saying. It's called Where Can You Find a Point of Leverage? This chapter is about finding a small part of the system where change can make a big difference. And one of the examples that he used that I liked was in healthcare. He was explaining that hospitals were seeing medication errors, and the initial response to that was just more training and reminders to the staff. And then they implemented this process where they started standardizing the labels and using checklists. And then after that, after they had a well-established system, the errors dropped because the system made it harder for them to make those mistakes. And the main idea of this chapter was that leverage, it can be in predictable spots. It's in like, if something keeps getting missed, it's usually because the process allows it to get missed. And it connects back to like what we're doing, where we're trying to automate things. So there's a clear process where there's next steps and automated triggers and like a standardized way to do things. And then I thought the takeaway was that a good system will like guide the behavior without needing constant attention. And then Kira, you have the next two chapters. How will you get early warning of the problem, and how will you know you're succeeding?
Thanks, Kayla. So I was really enjoying this book, but towards the beginning of the book, all I could really focus on was like the how. Like I understood the concept, but I was like so stuck on the fact of like, how do you really go upstream? So I feel like that this chapter 8 was basically like where it all started to kind of click for me. So this chapter is all about detecting risks. The story that begins in this chapter is about LinkedIn. So this is going back to like the 2000s when they initially created their recruiting product. It was offered as a subscription, and it's obviously designed to help companies find new hires. They found that it was selling really well, but the churn rate was high. I think it was like a 30% churn rate. And the churn rate is the percentage of customers who don't renew their subscription when it comes time for renewal. So that's a really good like way to see how a product, like the health of a product or a subscription, to see, how good it's doing is looking at that churn rate. So they hired an employee in 2010 who wanted to look into this a little bit more. They discovered that low engagement within the first 30 days of buying the recruiting product predicted later churn. And they used this early signal to refocus their efforts from saving accounts. So this kind of is like a similar situation that, as Mark was just describing, with like the seniors versus the freshmen. So instead of focusing on like saving the accounts towards the end of the subscription renewal and really connecting with the customers then, they decided to focus on the initial beginning of the subscription time. So they wanted to improve the onboarding process, which is what happens within that first 30 days. One good key here was that when they onboarded a new client to the product, they didn't just like show them how the product works or how to use it, or screen share, anything like that. Well, they did that, but they also actually did some of the work for them, which like really helped the success of it all. So essentially, they put in a new position at LinkedIn where these hires would actually like set up the specific recruiting template that they needed. So, for example, they would design a search to help a business find people who fit a specific profile in terms of location, job, etc., and then walked them through that, so that the business that's purchasing the product does not have to do a lot of the legwork. So the low engagement was really the smoke, that was the signal, and preventing problems requires building systems that detect that smoke early before that fire starts to spread. These predictors can be data-driven signals like engagement metrics we were just talking about, or they can be like human observations too, like behavior changes. But the key is to spot the patterns, and the earlier is really the better. Now I'll move on to the second chapter that I wanted to talk about, which was chapter 9. It was titled, How Will You Know You're Succeeding? So I think that this is probably one of the trickiest parts of upstream work, because when you prevent something from happening, it's not obvious, like it didn't happen, so you can't, the success is essentially invisible. It's hard to acknowledge the fact that something didn't happen because of the work that you did. Because in downstream work, success is obvious, a fire is put out, a broken machine is fixed, but upstream, nothing happens, and that's what makes it harder to measure. Heath warns about what he calls ghost victories. These happen when the numbers look good, but the mission isn't actually being achieved. And there are a few different ways that this could show up. Maybe metrics improve due to outside factors, not the efforts of going upstream. Or maybe short-term measures conflict with long-term goals. Or in some cases, the measure becomes the mission and people start optimizing for the metric rather than the actual outcome that they first set out for. So, for example, you might hit a target statistic while neglecting the people that the work was meant to help. And to avoid that, the author suggests like pre-gaming your measures, thinking ahead about how they could be gamed or misinterpreted. And you have to like pair the quantitative with the qualitative checks. You can do this by asking what else could explain this improvement, and how could someone technically hit this goal without really solving the problem. It's like doing the work ahead of time. The goal is to design metrics that actually reflect upstream progress, not just the activity in doing so.
back to Dylan, how do we ensure that prevention doesn't create new problems?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I thought of after I read this chapter was that prevention isn't automatically good. And when we try to prevent problems upstream, we can accidentally create new ones. So if we're not careful with how we draw up solutions, we can shift the problem somewhere else and make the problem even worse, or we can even hurt the very people that we're trying to help. So every system is interconnected. And when you change one part, the incentives can shift and people react in unexpected ways. So the prevention efforts that we take can backfire if we ignore those like unintended consequences and act too confidently without supporting evidence. So yeah, like prevention, it's not a one-time fix, and it's an ongoing process of learning. In order to ensure that prevention doesn't create new problems, we must understand like the importance of like testing and feedback and learning from data sets. So upstream work, it should be experimental and adaptive rather than rigid. You really need to test these things and see how they work in practice. So like before acting on any solution, we should first ask questions like, what problem are we trying to prevent? And what new problems might we accidentally create? And then from there, you can start small by just doing a test run of whatever it is. You do a test run, something small sample size, measure the data, and gather feedback from the people that are affected. And it's important to not just track the original problem, like we were talking about with ghost victories, but also watch for new issues that may form elsewhere. And the people like those that are closest to the problem often see risks that others will miss. So it's also important to get feedback from the people that are like affected by the changes made to the system. And closing thought, prevention is powerful, but it's not risk-free, and it works best when it's experimental and measured with humility, and when it's not rushed and overconfident.
Thanks, Dylan. I'm going to talk about one of the last chapters of the book. It's called The Chicken Little Problem. And this chapter is about why people ignore risks that feel distant, or they just feel like they're out of reach, even when the downside is huge. And the example that Heath used is wildfire prevention. And for years, when experts warned that dry forests could build up enough fuel that it could spread to a massive wildfire, just because it doesn't happen every year, people look at the warning signs and it's easy to dismiss them as overreaction. But when fires actually do happen, it's beyond costly and devastating. And at that point, everyone knows that the risk was real, but the damage is already done. So the issue is that people aren't irrational. It's that repeated warnings without the immediate consequences train people to tune it out. So that's how they get the name of the chapter. They sound like Chicken Little, even when they're right. And the solution that Heath points to is making risks tangible and assigning ownership. So back to that core idea that someone has to be responsible for the prevention work, even when nothing bad is happening. Otherwise, it never feels urgent enough to prioritize.
All right. So that's all we have for today's book club discussion. I want to thank the Bautis Financial team for being here, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you have a suggestion for our next book club, we'd love to hear it. You can email suggestions to info@bautisfinancial.com. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.
Don't forget to follow the Agent of Wealth on the platform you listen from and leave us a review of the show. We're currently accepting new clients, and if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one consultation with our advisors, please do so at bautisfinancial.com/call.
Thank you for listening to the Agent of Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bautis Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial planning and investment advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investments and financial planning.